Boys, girls, and NBs, welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society. Last episode, we spoke to Chris Hopwood about the psychology of human-animal intergroup relations. We're sort of continuing this conversation further with Dr. Chris Bryant today. Dr. Chris Bryant is the executive director of Bryant Research, a company which offers social science research services to animal advocacy organizations, among other things. He has an MSc, so Master in Sciences in Policy Research from the University of Bristol, and has his PhD in psychology from the University of Bath. His expertise lie in alternative proteins, and he has published multiple papers on the social dimensions of the protein transition. I do not know what he means in this context, so hopefully we can get him to elaborate a little bit more in this episode. So thank you for coming on, Chris.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
And Amr is back as co-host. If people watching the video were wearing the same clothes, because we're recording the both episodes back to back, one after each other. But yeah, Amr.
Well, yeah, I wear this. You didn't need to snitch on me, but because I wear this shirt for every episode I co-host. So
yeah, fair enough. All right, awesome. So let's get into it. Chris, I mentioned protein transition or the protein transition. Could you please elaborate on what you mean by that? Because as someone who does molecular research, for me, proteins are, amino acids, proteins. Maybe the most I think of it is diet related, but for me, the term alternative protein seems a bit weird. So if you could elaborate.
Right. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're really talking about animal food alternatives and animal product alternatives. So we're talking about plant-based meat and dairy alternatives, as well as fermentation-derived and cell-cultivated. So a whole range of animal product alternatives. And the idea with the protein transition is that, we've only been doing industrial farming of animals for about 50, 60 years. And before that, it was sort of much smaller scale. And we are now discovering, there was all sorts of drawbacks to this cool system that we thought we had come up with. We now have these massive factories which are breeding new diseases. We're constantly having to use antibiotics. They're using up our antibiotic supply. We're having to deforest large areas to feed these hungry animals, which then convert a very small amount of those calories into food for humans. So the idea with the protein transition is to go beyond this industrial animal farming system that we largely rely on at the moment and move towards much more efficient, much more healthy, and much more ethical choices.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm guessing so this is in terms of like you mentioned a few different variations. These are all sort of completely different because you said cell culture food. So this is like when you're growing meat in a lab versus
That's right.
Versus like I guess plant-based, like all your I can't believe it's not meat kind of stuff.
That's right, yeah.
So when you call yourself an expert in this, what do you mean?
Yeah, so I did my PhD in public perceptions of cell-cultivated meat. That involved doing a bunch of surveys and focus groups and that kind of thing. And then since then, I have worked with a couple of cultivated meat companies and a bunch of companies in alternative proteins industry more broadly, as well as a bunch of animal charities. So that's the other part of the protein transition, as well as having, good alternative products that are going to pull people towards them. There is, of course, what you might think of as like conventional animal advocacy, pushing people away from eating, factory farmed meat. So I think that both of those work together very well. And yeah, where we come in and what I do in the company is all on the social science side. So we're talking about surveys and focus groups. We're also talking about white papers and economic and policy assessments, which is more like desk research. So there's a bunch of things to do with consumer psychology, economics, policy that are all the kind of social questions around alternative proteins.
Right. So you mentioned there's a few. Well, you just named a few different types of ways protein-based products are made. was there? I'm curious about how these different techniques came about. Was it out of a need for, after say the initial type of protein-based product was made? Was there a nutritional lacking that inspired the others? Was it an economical reason? Was it uh, this the resources used? What were the sort of dynamics behind it growing and providing a different variety of different protein-based products?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very motivated field full of people who are concerned with all these kind of different problems with the conventional protein production system that we have today. There's a lot of people who are primarily like environmentally motivated, right? They see the vast amounts of land and agricultural resources that go into rearing animals. They see that we're demanding more and more meat every year, and so there's a lot of people who, starting from an environmental perspective, then saying, how can we make meat that's going to keep us within those parameters, basically. There are one or two people who are also coming at it from a public health perspective, where they're concerned about antibiotics and or pandemics. I mean, you just have a situation in factory farms where you've got all of these animals packed in tightly together. They're in dirty conditions, and they're also all very genetically similar because they've come from the same. So when they start getting diseases, it spreads super easily and mutates. Each time it spreads, it can mutate and then pass on to. We've got bird flu at the moment, right? So there's all these kind of problems, and then you do have a lot of people who are, animal people as well, and looking at the problem and saying it's not really acceptable that we're actually keeping billions of animals in factory farms, and right from the animals' perspective. So there are a bunch of different problems that all come together in the way that we're producing our food, and in particular animal products at the moment. And as a result of that, you do have what seems to me like a very uniquely motivated sector full of people who are like, really want to get this done and really want to spend their life's mission to do this, and have left or foregone other potentially very lucrative careers. There's all these kind of top Harvard doctors that go into making cultivated meat and stuff like that. So there are some very, very motivated people that have all these kind of different problems that they see with the current production system and see a way to do it better. And then I think between the different types of alternative proteins, I mean, sometimes one thing that people sometimes say is, might cultivated meat at this stage, when it comes along, be mainly competing with plant-based meat, right? The idea is you want to displace demand for animals. I think there is probably a little bit of overlap in the markets, but there's enough non-overlap, right? Where, for example, cultivated meat tends to be more appealing to men and to heavier meat eaters, whereas plant-based meats tends to be more appealing to women and to more like flexitarians, right? So there's already that kind of difference in the markets that they can serve from that perspective as well.
That's very interesting. I mean, I guess it makes sense that like a cultivated meat would appeal more to meat eaters than sort of like a plant-based alternative. So you said that you conduct a lot of surveys and do a lot of workshops around this stuff. So are these the kind of questions you go around asking people, or what does your research sort of entail in these regards?
Yeah, we do. So we've done focus groups where the aim will be to kind of see how ideas on new topics emerge in a social group. Often the reason that you would want to do focus groups instead of interviews is to sort of simulate this social environment where people do find out new information. They're watching the news together, they can discuss it or whatever it may be, right? So it's this idea that these attitudes are like socially formed, and you recreate that in a focus group. Then on the survey side, usually the most useful thing in surveys is getting like a representative view. Obviously, you're not going to have that many people in focus groups, right? But in a survey, you can get 1,000 people today and be all different representative demographics and everything. So that's good for saying, overall, this is what people think or would vote for, and then you can zoom in and say specific groups like men or older people or whatever it may be. But then some of the most interesting stuff, I think, is experimental research, where we'll have people exposed to different messages and then filling in the same measures, and we can see the people who saw message A versus message B. We've just wrapped up a really nice big study where we had some decent funding to do a good amount of advertising on social media, but also to actually get a retail data set of like sales figures from retailers on pork. And that was really great because usually we are relying to a large extent on like survey responses. And of course, people are not always honest. People don't always remember what they've eaten. There might be all sorts of reasons that people are giving incorrect answers. Whereas when you've got retail data, and it's very expensive to get, these retailers just have it on a spreadsheet and they'll sell it to you for a few £1,000s, right? So it's very expensive to get, but it is accurate, to the sausage. So we ran these big, there was sort of like grim videos of pig farming on Facebook adverts in 4 regions of the UK. And then we had pork sales for all of the UK during that period. And we could see the regions where we've run the ads, it has an effect on pork sales compared to the regions without ads. So that kind of thing is quite cool because it really cuts through all of the unreliability of humans, I guess. Like, you did buy sausages, doesn't matter what you're filling on the survey, right? We can see kind of the direct impact of the behavior in different places. So I think for me, the experimental stuff is some of the coolest. Yeah.
Now, are we sure those sausages aren't just filled with couch stuffings, the cheap types, and not the actual ones with pork in? That's the unreliability of the supplier now, isn't it?
Well, that's right. Yeah, we got so we've done pork measures. We've measured pork and frozen pork, and also plant-based pork alternatives and frozen plant-based pork alternatives as well. And we had 2 different versions of the ad, where one is saying don't eat meat and one saying try plant-based instead. So we look at like sort of different variations of how that might work. We also try to end sort of left-wing and right-wing areas politically. That's kind of interesting. So there's all sorts of things that you can do to look at the best way of doing these kind of campaigns. So yeah.
Cool. I want to sort of like pick on that a little bit. So you don't need to talk about things which you have not published, but of the stuff which you have you done any sort of experiments like this which you have sort of published? Because you said this one was you just recently completed. So have you done any stuff which you have already published, which we can talk about?
Yeah. The actually the social media ads with the retail data was kind of an upgrade from a study that we did, I guess, a couple of years ago, where we didn't have the budget for retail data this time, and so one of the things that food choice researchers will burn a lot of fuel on is like how to actually measure this, right? Like we say, surveys pretty imperfect, retail data very expensive. What we did in this case, we ran some billboards about dairy. In this case, it was a picture of a dairy cow, and it says dairy cows cry when we take away their babies for milk. And then we ran these big billboards in Bristol and had a control city where we didn't have any billboards. And then my research assistant and I went around residential bins in the area and took photos of the food packaging that people were throwing in the trash. So we literally went to blocks of flats, blocks of apartments with the big sort of communal trash skips, took a photo of the cross-section of that, and then took them all home, got all the photos and say, okay, this is, how many litres of milk versus how many litres of plant-based milk. Did that twice in Bristol and twice in another city. And then we can see sort of before and after, the difference in differences. And so that involved us literally putting on high vis, going around opening up the bins in random people's flats.
Wow.
And that was really a lot cheaper, but not worth it. Probably we didn't quite get to any significant results from that either, so that was a waste of time.
It's also hard. What if like some people just don't throw their trash out until all the trash in the trash cans are from before the ads? Bins haven't been taken out. What do you do then? You're relying on the council as well to be on time with their.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of things that that are like imperfect about that way of measuring. To be fair, because of course, yes, like you say, maybe we literally did it. We went, took photos of the bins, ran the billboards 4 weeks, and then 4 weeks later went back and did it again. So it's still, but it's. I mean, there's all sorts of unreliable things about that, right? Maybe someone was on holiday that week, maybe they didn't, right? Whatever. So in theory, if you're doing enough bins, it's one of those things where hopefully there's the same number of people on holiday in Bristol as there is in the other city, so it kind of evens out. But I mean, it's much less reliable than just looking at the retail data.
The other thing which I want to ask, because you said Bristol and the other city, city demographics in the UK, I have noticed are very different based on which city you are in. So does that play a part as well? Because in sort of your control city, which you're going to pick in this regard?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there will be, Bristol is like quite left wing, quite bohemian area, probably more vegans than average, right? So there is a bit of that. So in this study design, we have a measure in Bristol before and a measure in Bristol after, and we also had a measure in the control city before and a measure in the control city after.
Mm-hmm.
So you have 4 points, and each of those is like what percentage of the total milk consumed was plant-based, and it was a pretty small sort of percent. It was like 5% or something when we worked it out, right? But you can say, okay, so in Bristol it went from 5% to, I think they actually both went down. So I think despite the bill was 5% to like 4.5%, let's say. But in the other city, even if it started lower at 3%, well, it went down to 1%. So it's a bigger difference, and so that accounts for differences in the cities, but it also kind of cancels out trends that might be happening over time generally. So, for example, maybe during that period there was a bad news story about plant-based milk or whatever it may be, or a good news story about dairy milk, and that made that percentage go down everywhere. But because we can see the difference in our city with the billboards versus the difference in some other city without the billboards, you can do what's called a difference in differences, and therefore you can kind of control for both of those factors, in theory at least. But it is messy.
Did it take into account? Well, I haven't lived in the UK for a long time, just a couple summers in the previous decade. But is there much fluctuation in price of products based on supply, and was any consideration taken to that uh, during this period? So for changing price of meats, but so if say for example the price of pork went up, did that could that have been an effect of the reduced purchase of pork?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually weirdly did see fresh pork sales going down slightly everywhere, and then frozen pork sales going up actually quite massively everywhere. But there's a small amount, so a 50% increase, it can still be quite a small amount, like net. So yeah, I mean, there are sort of nationwide trends that will go with pricing. Where you do get difficulties is sometimes they will do like regional promotions. So the 2-for-1 deals in your Sainsbury's might not be the same as the 2-for-1 deals in my Sainsbury's. So that can make it a little bit different, because maybe there's really great pork promotions in our test regions. So yeah, there will be some difficulty around things like that. But in general, for me, I think that's one of the tightest studies that we've done in terms of really demonstrate. These are real ads that we put out there in the world. Here's some real retail data of people buying the stuff. It worked, right? So it's oftentimes you're working with many more assumptions and constraints than in that situation. Yeah.
And sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'm I'm thinking of sort of how all I can think of is like I'm trying to think of other sort of confounding variables. The one which I thought of was the one which you said about promotional deals. Certain like places would have them. Certain places, if the pork's going bad, for example, they might want to sell it off quicker, so they'd like put those reduced labels on them or whatever. With your sort of retail prices, when you get this information, do you also get sort of that like these sales were on at these times and things like that, or is it because this study is sort of like really large, you have enough data from enough places that you can sort of counter it based on just like put it in variance?
Yeah, we didn't have data on specific regional promotions which might have been going on, which would be, kind of a more detailed way that you could look at it. One interesting part of it that we did do was 2 left wing and 2 right wing areas, as I mentioned. We ran ads in, and the ads in the right wing areas where they so what they were is 2 areas which had the highest proportion of green votes, and then 2 areas which had the highest proportion of reform votes. So the right wing areas were a much lower cost per click on the ads, so like to our surprise, right, higher engagement. But we think that a lot of that was like people clicking on to comment and argue, basically, rather than click. Do you know what I mean? So it was a bit more of a novel message, probably, in these, right wing, presumably heavier meat consuming areas than it would have been in, Brighton or whatever kind of bohemian left wing area. But yeah, we did see, and then we paired up those areas because obviously one thing when we were looking at the data, then we're looking at these quite unusual 4 areas compared to the whole rest of the country, which is a little bit unusual. So we paired up with some sort of control left and right wing areas, basically, which was like this, the second highest voting reform area. And we can do that comparison as well. If these left wing, the left wing areas with the ads consumed less pork than the left wing areas without the ads, sort of thing. So you can do sort of more granular zooms in like that. But yeah, I've always found it kind of interesting thinking about, I suppose, research design and how you can try to cancel out or account for different confounders that can come in. But yeah, it's very difficult. And I think that's one of the trickier things about social science than sort of in the lab or hard science, is that you can never really actually cancel out everything. You can never have a perfectly controlled social experiment. Whereas you can have pretty close to that in a lot of, hard sciences. So it's always asterisk is always coming with the results in social science.
So from there, so I would ask you, so if to progress with these experiments, progress with the study, what would be the next step you're going to be taking?
Yeah, good question. I think, honestly, I'm thinking a lot about doing it and executing it now. Now, we're a research organization and we are here to research the things which will be done. But I'm increasingly feeling we're getting a good handle and getting closer understanding of how you would go about actually changing things. So, for example, with the social media ads, I think that's when that's published, I think it'll be pretty solid proof that this worked. Will it be the most cost efficient thing? I don't know. Maybe there will be, in effective animal advocacy, which is kind of where our organization sits. There will be cost effectiveness estimates for different types of campaigns and interventions that you can do, and generally, it's thought, or generally it's thought that and argued that, and I think that institutional campaigns are going to be, the best bang for the buck, most animals saved per dollar or whatever. And so a lot of EAA, effective animal advocacy, that is, research is not necessarily super interested in this kind of like individual level persuasion, like getting people to go vegan sort of research, basically. But that said, I think is an important part of the process as well, because on the institutional side, you can really only get institutions to make changes if consumers are willing to accept them, if individual consumers and shareholders and voters are willing to go along with the thing. So, yeah, I think that it's good that we're doing lots of institutional change, and we do need to keep doing it. And we do need to start to, I think, operationalize some of what we've learned in terms of communicating with individuals and so on as well.
So when you're saying go on and do it, are you talking it from a advocacy standpoint or from a policy standpoint, or like once you have this research, who's your sort of target audience for affecting this change?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think there's a few. One is policymakers, definitely, and a lot of our research is geared towards policy relevant questions. So that's a cool thing about doing kind of applied research as opposed to more academic stuff. When I was doing my PhD and in the university, it was very much theory first, basically, which I guess is the job of academia, I suppose. But it wasn't like super applied. Whereas now, yeah, I think that doing things by starting of saying like, what will the relevant outcome of this be. I often think about research as either informative within the movement or the organization, or in terms of strategic questions, they didn't know what they were going to do before, now they know what they're going to do, or are more informed at least. So that's kind of one type of research. And I kind of thought that would be the more common thing when we started. But actually, the more common thing seems to be the other kind, which is we pretty much do already know the answer to this, but we need to demonstrate it in a scientifically robust way. For example, we do lots of things that are like showing that some institution could cut their carbon footprint if they change to plant-based defaults on their menu, for example. Now, we already know that they can cut their carbon footprint by doing that, but it's still useful to have, a PDF that demonstrates how and has the calculations and everything else. So that is more like for what I would consider external stakeholders to communicate with, right? Who is the decision maker of that organization or the policymaker that you need to go and show this to. So those are kind of two broadly. Either we don't know the answer, we want to know the answer, or we basically do know the answer, but we want it written down nicely.
On this topic of stakeholders, it actually brought me back to something you said at the start of this conversation regarding how industrial poultry and cattle farming was popularized about 60 odd years ago, if I'm is what you said, if I'm not mistaken. So it just took me back to the start, as from what I remember from what I want to say year six history, is that we went from hunter gatherers to agricultural farming. So what uh, what was the progress that took us back to, balancing these two things, going back to both these things rather than progressing forward with just agricultural farming?
Yeah, well, I mean, agriculture is massively helpful, and yeah, like you say, is what has basically enabled human civilization to develop from being hunter-gatherers, right? So it's not agriculture itself that's the problem, but intensive industrialized animal agriculture, where only in the last 50, 60 years have we had these huge warehouses of hundreds of thousands of chickens, for example, and we have all these kind of big prison rows of cages to keep them all in and stuff like this. So that form of mega animal farming, basically, where there's thousands and thousands of animals, there's they have to use antibiotics in order to keep them getting sick, and then they still get sick, right? So that kind of sort of hyper farming, factory farming, has only been around for 60 odd years. And if you look at the animals as well, they've changed a lot in that time. You've seen the photos of like the chicken in the 1950s who looks like he's ready to run the Olympics versus the chickens now who are like look like they're ready to do the sumo wrestling, right? I mean, it's
They'll still be part of the Olympics either ways.
right. Oh, that's right. Yes, yeah. But yeah, I mean, so much has changed in that time about how all of food's produced, really. But yeah, factory farming of animals is not a game that we've been playing for very long, and we're only just kind of starting to clock on to all of the problems that it brings.
Okay, I'm sorry, you go.
Yeah, I kind of see a pattern here with humanity finding problems and things after going all in, chips on the table with it. From this to fossil fuel usage to the internet, now we're heading AI. AI is heading in that direction.
Yeah.
It's kind of a never-ending cycle, isn't it?
No, it's that meme. The consequences of my actions.
Yes.
Well. If it's not the no. But talking to your point, you also mentioned, and because you work with people sort of in cultured meats and plant-based meats, sort of with companies to actually do this. What is the sort of drive like? Because you did mention that there's not that much funding or there's not that much money investment in it as it stands, but it is slowly growing. What do companies who are working in it at the moment sort of think of it being able to transition from what is currently like from the current status to sort of like a more plant or alternative meat based world or majority alternative meat based world?
Yeah, I think there's been a weird few years in this area because seemed about 5 years ago that all of this suddenly got very popular. And then you had, plant-based Burger King and everything else, which is great. And I, had a plant-based McDonald's earlier today. But there definitely was a period where like there was a ton of brands bringing out new products. There was companies springing up. There were then all of the big Unilever and all of the big food companies started to make their own alternative protein products. And I think that a lot of companies, especially in the big companies where they're kind of like, oh, this plant-based thing's happening, right? Sling out some plant-based product, kind of just thought that this was going to be the trend now and didn't pay that much attention to developing good products or making good stuff. Basically, they were like, let's make something that's going to be in this growing category. And there was a period of at least a couple of years where if you went to the plant-based section in the supermarket, it's like different stuff each week. You would get different brands coming and going. There was like very segmented, like tiny sections of each. And that was never going to stay like that. Though I remember saying at the time, most of these companies are going to go bust. It has to happen because there were way more companies than the was appropriate for the size of the category. But I also think that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's like creative destruction, right? Those companies which are good enough stay and outcompete the others, and those ones which are not good enough or are too expensive or people don't like, they leave and they don't get brought back the next week, right? So it makes the category better overall when that happens. But certainly, it has been. There have been companies come and go in the area, and it's been a lot of that hype from 2020 era sort of crescendoed in about 2022, and there has been a couple of years of tougher sales for some companies since then. There's also opportunities in different areas. There are more companies coming out with products which are not necessarily meant to be conventional meat imitations. They're just something else entirely. There has been, I believe that companies like Tofu and Tempeh have done quite well in the last couple of years when it's been difficult because a lot of that has been as a result of all of the narrative around ultra-processed foods, which, we can talk about that. That's a bit of a hobby horse of mine. I think is a complete distraction, really, and like not good form of analysis for food healthiness. But yeah, there seems to be companies reacting to that sort of thing. But I think basically what it comes down to, and organizations like GFI have said this from the start, it will be about getting products which are more enjoyable and cheaper, and that's it. Like that is it. I mean, once you get to that point, why would anyone want to pay more for worse food? You just wouldn't, right? So I think that getting product development is going to be the key that drives it forward. there was and there continues to be a loyal customer base who are like, we're doing this out of our ethical beliefs or environmental preferences or health preferences, whatever it may be. But I think that really product development is going to be the thing that gets it over the line, and price parity, especially in this economy, right? Everything's suddenly very expensive, and so there are now some plant-based products that are cheaper than the meat products. And when everyone's trying to get their food shop as cheap as possible, I just don't think that people are going to pay more for animal products just because they're animal products. We'll see, though. We'll see.
Just building on that just a little bit, and also I guess bringing it back to the sort of conservative versus more liberal sort of towns and cities. A lot of these conservative places also are generally more rural places as well. Am I right in sort of thinking? And most farming communities would be sort of more right wing in that regard. Would that also come as a clash in the sense that so many people are potentially employed in the current industrial farming sector that developing a completely new sector, which potentially is less intensive in terms of employment, can actually be some of the pushback is actually due to the fear of losing livelihoods, and whether sort of governments or anyone has sort of the I don't know, like the safety net or like a fallback to help people in that regard. Because at the moment, I know farming industries all over the world generally are subsidized, right, by whatever governments have subsidized some aspect of the industry to help it. So yeah, if suppose alternative proteins come up, then yeah, is there that sort of fear? Do you see that when you do your surveys and interviews and things like that?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that most people. So a lot of people will mention like, oh, the economic impacts and what will happen to the farmers and so on. I think that from the consumer perspective, ultimately, I don't think anyone's going to be like, I'm going to keep buying this because I want to support the farmers, right? We'll just want to have cheap, affordable, like nice food, basically, right? So I think sometimes people say that won't necessarily affect their purchasing, but from the perspective of those communities, right, and the political resistance that can come from that, I think there's definitely something that needs to be addressed. At the moment, we have a very kind of bizarre situation where the factory farm lobbies are very good at using the small farmers as the kind of face of the industry and having them represent concern and making them concerned about alternative proteins. And if you look at Italy, which has banned cultivated meat before it's even available for sale, that is done on the basis of convincing farmers that this is the cause of their problems. And it's such an interesting situation because, yeah, farming livelihoods, yes, but also their like culture and heritage and everything. A lot of farmers are like, my father farmed this field and his father, right? This been our family for 300 years or whatever. So it's and it's their identity and it's their place in the community. Oh, that's the Smith farm or whatever it is, right? So it's very, there is absolutely anxiety around that, right? And that's absolutely an issue. And if you look at the number of farming jobs in the UK, to take an example, but it's a pretty similar story anywhere else, since like the 1960s, when we started to industrialize farming more, the number of farming jobs has gone down. I think we've lost 2/3 of the farming jobs since 1960. So there really is fewer farming jobs than there used to be. But it's not because people are eating less meat, because of course, also since 1960, meat production has gone up and up and up. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a political dynamic where there's kind of a feeling that these alternative proteins are a threat to us farmers, and that has been exploited very effectively in somewhere like Italy, where again, cultivated meat is not sold 1 ounce in Italy, right? And somehow these farmers were convinced this is the cause of their problems, and you had the lobbies going around giving them these signs that they could hold at the protest and everything. It's crazy. There definitely are powerful interests who are opposed to alternative proteins and actively lobbying against them, trying to have what looks like farmers being organized against alternative proteins. The forces doing that organizing, unfortunately, are the same forces that are actually decimating farming jobs by making more and more industrial farms. So essentially, it's factory farms, small farmers, and alternative proteins. The factory farms kind of in the middle, producing almost all the food and pointing to both sides and saying, why don't you two argue with each other? So, for people on my side as well, we can get drawn into that. Oh, yeah, it's vegans versus farmers, right? We hate the animal farmers. But no, it's for most small-scale farmers are not the problem and are not who we want to be displacing. We are mainly concerned about factory farmed products, really we are. And so I think that there can be and needs to be a bit more, some sort of unholy political alliance between those. Right, there was a report that called us the techno-vegans and the agroecologists, and that might be a good marriage of convenience, as they said in the report, to basically our common enemy is factory farming. And if you speak to people who are small scale farmers, they totally agree with that. But we've been allowed to be sort of put into opposing camps, and I think that plays very well for the factory farms who are there to just clean up everything.
It's sort of from someone outside of the UK. You hear about, well, I've heard about the show, and I've seen a little bit of the show Clarkson's Farm, which highlights the plight of farmers and people in working in agriculture, of how the bureaucracy and the system just prevents them from from doing their job and being able to thrive at their job. And it's sort of, with this additional perspective, it just provides. It seems like it'll provide industrial farmers the ability to use crocodile tears or just use genuine farmers in need as pawns to loosen and then abuse any sort of loosened restrictions on farming, which are meant for small business farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. In the UK, there was just this big thing about inheritance tax on farms. I don't know if you guys saw any of this. Basically, for a long time, if you live on a farm, it is exempt from inheritance tax, and so you'll be able to pass it on without paying any tax. Right? And that's the idea, is that if you have these family farms or for generations, right, you don't actually want the government to come along and kind of take a slice of it every time it gets passed on. Now, some people say that was a little bit abused and a bit of a loophole, because basically what you would have is then sort of rich families get a couple of pigs in the garden and say, oh, look, we're a farm now, no inheritance tax. So that was part of the reason for getting rid of it. But to the extent that it is used by, good faith, small scale farmers who this is their operation and everything, well, getting rid of that tax exemption is basically an additional tax on the small farmers. And again, this only applies if it's your home. So that it is a tax that would apply to small farms and that doesn't apply to factory farms. Or I guess an exemption that no longer applies to small farms and already wasn't applied to factory farms. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's wrong, right? Like in theory, the way it should have worked is you're taxing factory farms, right? You're supposed to be, this is not part of our actual conversation, but now that we've gone down this route, if because I remember something else as well in the UK, they put recently they put up taxes on people selling products through eBay or Amazon. Like there's now a limit of how much you can sell before you're taxed on it or something like that. And I'm like, you're taxing them, but you're not. But Amazon doesn't need to pay tax because they're a company in Ireland. I don't know what's going
right.
on.
Amazon themselves don't pay any tax. Yeah.
What logic is this? Yeah. So yeah. I mean, the whole political. I feel the field which you work in inherently becomes very political because it's on one of these sort of issues which are at least sold as a clear right-left divide in a lot of circumstances. So I feel, yeah, this is another. yeah, you'd be involved with a lot of sort of lobbying or advocacy groups around it.
Yeah, it's definitely a tricky one, and I think that people on our side can be a bit too put off by, the backlash, quote unquote. Now, it depends what you're working on and how much consensus you need to build about certain things, but it seems to me like there are a bunch of things worth saying and that are true that might not be popular, that oftentimes with research, like, I'm not a politician. It's not my job to be popular. It doesn't really matter if no one likes me, frankly. So I do feel, that's nice to be able to say, I'm going to say this thing that I think is true. I don't really care if nobody likes it. I think I can argue for it. And also, one of the things I've been doing recently is calling out a lot of pro-meat science, which is just complete crap. There was one study that came out which was called an umbrella review, and they were looking at red meat and heart disease, and they adapted a ranking of strength of evidence to say this is what would count as convincing evidence, this would count as probable evidence, this counts as possible, this is not convincing, like that. And they had these criteria for convincing and for probable evidence that were impossible to meet. Like, if you're taking a set of studies, there was no heterogeneity, which is a boring statistical point, but basically you would never get zero heterogeneity. It would be like a 0 point something number. And what was the other one? No potential confounding variables, which again, like, as we've discussed in this conversation, just doesn't really happen. If you're trying to do a study on red meat and heart disease, like, did some of the people smoke? Yes, they did, right? Now, if you've got hundreds of thousands of people, that's going to cancel out, but you would never have a criteria that says no potential confounding variables. So they've got this table, right? They've got these impossible to meet criteria in the convincing evidence row and in the probable evidence row. The evidence hasn't met those impossible to meet criteria, surprise, surprise. And then so they've said, therefore, it's only in the third row, red meat possibly connected to heart disease, not very strong evidence. And they just completely made up this rating system in order to get to that conclusion. It's quite shocking. But there's all sorts of examples like this now where there's kind of warped science around different things to do with meat. And there are, this is a conscious strategy on their part to try to muddy the waters and to try to. There's a lot of the regenerative agroecology stuff is around this as well. Oh, maybe there's carbon sequestration in the soil from some types of agriculture. It's like there's a tiny proportion of all agriculture. And it's not carbon negative. It's not sequestering as much carbon as the animals are producing. But it's annoying because science isn't meant to be that you can kind of just create a vibe and then that's what sticks. But it kind of is when it comes to interfacing with policymakers and stuff like that. If you just have like weeks on end of hearing about anemia, you're going to start thinking, wow, anemia is a real problem. We need to get everyone eating more red meat. But actually, anemia is not that big a problem, and heart disease is a big problem. So it's very, there can be true facts that are just not presented in a context that they're like presented out of context and in a way that's kind of irrelevant, like about anemia or about agroecology. It's like, okay, these things are not incorrect, but they're just such a small problem compared to all the massive problems on the other side that having, endless reports and news coverage on these things is kind of misleading.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about, shouldn't there be like better review for such things? Like, that sounds like a conflict of interest if a paper is coming out. Either it's not very good science, and you've been allowed to publish it because there's an oversight on the reviewer's part, on peer review part, or there's a conflict of interest there which has not been addressed, right? Because otherwise, most researchers worth their soul should know that these criteria, if they are how you've mentioned it, are incorrect. Like, you cannot be safe.
You
Can't be
would think
performing
so,
it.
yeah. You would think so, yeah. And I mean, so one interesting thing here is peer review really is not like as robust as most people think it is. I've published a bunch of peer-reviewed papers. I've peer-reviewed a bunch of papers. It is just a bloke like me getting an email that says, "Can you read this paper and tell us if you think it's all right?" Like, it's not. I'm not God. I don't know everything, right? I have 100 other things on my to-do list, and also you don't get paid to do reviews either. So you get an email from some random bloke saying, "Can you give me 3 hours of your day to read this?" All right, maybe, but like I don't do many of them anymore because it's literally a thankless. It's anonymous as well, right? So it's literally a thankless task. But yeah, I mean, having had papers reviewed and having reviewed papers, you can get some bad stuff published in a peer-reviewed journal. You really can. It just means that two busy people signed off on it, basically, and that's it. And you get stuff published in papers which is like clearly mistakes and ChatGPT generated or whatever, and it still says hi, yes, I can do that for you. You've seen those kind of memes, right? But it really is a game of all of academic publishing is a bit of a, I don't want to say a scam, but so much of it is a game and like shitified. Have you ever heard this phrase? Shit, like things that used to be good, like somehow the market kind of corrupts them. Basically, once you have this situation where you've got a bunch of academics, a bunch of well-paid people who their time is going towards these projects of publishing papers, they don't expect to get paid to write papers. They don't expect to get paid to review papers, and they don't expect to get paid to serve as an editor for the journal. So that sounds like great money to be made to me, right? I'm going to set up a journal, get a bunch of academics to work for me for free, and I am charging, access fees and publication fees and everything else. So basically, academic publishing, and anyone who does academic publishing will tell you the same thing. It really is a bit of a game now. There is a lot of pay to play. You can do, pay a couple $1,000s to get your article published over there, and we're not going to look at it too closely if you pay on time, basically. So yeah, things being published in journals, it doesn't make them right. Which is a shame, right? Because the whole endeavor is meant to be that we're going to have a quite a high standard for saying anything gets published, but then we're going to be very sure when we go to write the next thing, I can rely on that because it was published in a peer review. But it's not quite that simple, unfortunately.
No, I remember talking. Oh, we had a podcast with Mehmet Orhan, who's in Paris, one of the universities in Paris. I'm forgetting which one, or maybe it was the University of Normandy. Anyway, last year, and he was talking about him doing sort of an analysis of for fun, just doing an analysis of the bias in publications, and that some of the highest journals just have like that same network of people just publishing in it nonstop, and you can never get into high level journals because it's so biased, and then the low level ones people don't have time, and you're paying, and most people, like you said, for doing the reviews are not paid for their time to do it, so most of them are trying to do their own work, so they're going to not look at it very well, and it just leads to a lot of like not false science, but like bad science being put out there, or and then if any of those get picked up by news organizations, then they become big stories, and big stories are coming out of sort of information which is not necessarily correct.
Yeah, it's a real problem, and I mean, it's tough to know what to do about it because we do need to have a reliable way of saying, okay, we agree this is sort of our standard for truth, and that we can count on things past a certain threshold. But yeah, I mean, it is a real problem. There's journals that have sprung up that seem to be entirely scam journals, basically, like predatory journals, they're called. There's also conferences which seem to be pretty much a similar model. And again, it's a bit weird in academia, really, because normally you've got some grant or some university department that's paying for all of this. But if you go to speak at a conference, you don't get paid, you pay. So again, it's like, well, here's an industry where people expect to go and pay to go and speak at a conference. Hell, I'll start a conference company, right? I got the speakers paying, I got the attendees paying, maybe I get the bar staff paying as well, right? Like, what is it? But that's the expectation, that's the norm. And so, yeah, it does like attract vultures, I guess you could say. Was it a very good way of putting it? Like, yeah.
I look forward to everybody attending the first Smooth Brain Society conference in a year's time.
Yes.
We'll be setting it up. Now I think it's like shockingly bad sometimes as someone who also works in academia. And yeah, because then it dilutes, because it causes harm to when good science comes out there, right? And then it muddies the water more and it ruins trust in the entire process, and then it allows other people making weird things up about stones working for your health and God knows, and that's given the same level of belief as rigorous scientific work, which is actually conducted well. And yeah, it's a very annoying process.
Yeah. Even just like from a career and like time perspective. I mean, if you've spent, 18 months getting the data together and writing this paper and submit it to a journal and it gets rejected, you're going to send it to another journal and you're probably going to keep doing that until it gets published. So like a lot of the papers that I've published have been rejected from a journal first, been rejected from more than one journal sometimes. So stuff which is ultimately published, like sometimes was rejected from a journal first. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad or wrong either, but it's just another note on sort of the dynamics at play, because you're going to get, I've been asked to review the same study for more than one different journal. I'm like, oh, they're just sending this. There's only so many reviewers are going to give their time to it. And once, I think, from the author's perspective, once you've written it, you're just in the last bit of getting it published. So you're going to keep going until you get it published. From the editor's perspective, once you've had the journal, once you've had the paper in, you've done the trouble of finding reviewers, sent it out to reviewers, had their reviews in, sent it back to the author, sent it back to the reviewers again. Once you've done all that, to reject the paper after all of that does feel like, oh, that was a waste of time, right? So I think, to be honest, at that point, I think there is quite a big bias towards like, we are going to publish this thing. We've gone to all the trouble, basically, which again, like, you don't really want that to be a feature of the process. You do want it to be, no, if it's not good enough, it doesn't get published. But I don't know how to ensure that, because all of the metrics that these people would want to show to their bosses, I guess, are to do with how many papers did you publish, how many, citation count is sort of a crude way to try to get at the quality of those publications, but then it's,
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the topic as well, right? If it's a less research topic, there's going to be fewer citations.
That's true, yes.
So then that, again, causes a big problem. Well, what was it? Einstein's paper didn't have any citations in it, the one which he published. It was just his work.
Oh, really?
So I'm like, if you use citations as a thing. But we went on this tangent for a little bit. And we're coming to an hour, so I should ask you: are there any parts of the conversation? Are there any things that you wanted to say which we didn't get to touch upon? Sort of final. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there are a bunch of things. I mean, yeah, we could probably talk for hours, really, couldn't we? I think hopefully it's an interesting thing to your listeners more broadly. This point about like how science is done and the structure of journals and the kind of suboptimal human ways in which we kind of mess up the process. All of that's a bit doomerish, really, isn't it? Because if you have a sense of like how important it actually is to get the scientific process right, it's very horrifying when you think, God, we're getting it quite wrong. So I don't know really what to make of that. I think that, bless peer reviewers, because people do need to do it, and it really is a thankless task. And actually, maybe this conversation will inspire me to do one or two more reviews than I might have done. I do review for Chris Hopwood's journal still, actually. That's one that I do still review for. But yeah, I think that, for people out there who are scientists, I think it is really important to speak up in informal channels when you think something is wrong as well. I've been maybe a bit too boisterous on LinkedIn and on YouTube, making sort of call outs of bad science. And I think it's easy to think, oh, well, that's just social media. It's not really proper. It doesn't really matter. But that is where most people are going to see it and interact with it and get a sense. Most people are not going to read the whole thing and understand why it was wrong, but they can kind of follow an interaction where people are arguing about it and see who seems to be right, which again is kind of suboptimal. But to the extent that you think there's like cynically misrepresented or deliberately bad science going on, do feel that you can call it out, because ultimately whether something is true is going to become apparent. And if you were the one, screaming it was right when everyone else was saying the wrong thing, you'll be shown to be right in the end.
Opinion pieces presented as factual evidence is a bit of a thing these days, unfortunately. It's really, really muddies the waters. It occasionally prompts, if you go to the right places, it prompts some interesting questions in whichever direction you like. But there has to be some standard preserved for some ethical standards and quality standards preserved in the areas where people can look to for and accurately say that fact is a fact. That's it. Like it's not an opinion, right?
Yeah.
Like, and we hope that peer-reviewed journals can maintain that sort of integrity and be that bastion where scientists can rely on to present those facts and evidence.
Yeah, I hope so. And they're not so many times. Facts are a lot of times it's down to interpretation or context or methodological point, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is just, no, this was just incorrect. So those are good, not good, but satisfying ones where you can discover, oh, and now we all see that it's incorrect and we all agree that it was incorrect. But more often than that, it seems to be, usually the game is not actually lying and saying incorrect facts, but rather it's just saying a bunch of things that are technically true around some sort of conclusion that you want to get to without ever actually saying the conclusion. So best example of this, and the main I'll say junk science that I go after, is this thing called the Dublin Declaration, which is a document written to give the vibe that we don't need to reduce global meat consumption, and has sign-on from over 1,000 scientists, but it doesn't ever actually claim that. It just has all of these things about, my favorite phrase in there, it has this phrase, animal foods are a source of essential nutrients. Now that sentence is true, right? But it doesn't say animal foods are an essential source of nutrients. They are a source of essential nutrients because they do have protein in them, but they're not, and you don't have to eat animal. That's such a silly point if you think about it. I mean, the gravel on my driveway is a source of essential nutrients, has calcium in it, right? It's such a nothing point. But so the whole document is like a series of 100 sentences like that back to back that is designed to give the vibe that meat consumption is all fine. We don't need to do anything about meat consumption, without ever actually claiming that. And so you can kind of read a sentence and say none of this is incorrect, but it's super misleading when taken as a whole. So it's very tricky. The misinformation is very sophisticated now,
Yeah, and as we know, people in STEM tend to not have the best English.
Not the best people skills.
Yeah.
So, but now on that, we'll leave it over there. So thank you so much, Chris. We need to have you back on to converse more. Hopefully, once you have more information about your study, your big study, and we can see what other porks have been sold or not sold, what other meat-based products you've been advertising or not advertising, and also the comments on the adverts. That's what I'd be interested in hearing. What sort of
there'll be some interesting ones.
Knowing my brother, he's probably keen to know if you had any humor focused ads and if they had more or less of an effect on the final.
Okay, we'll have to check that out. I'll have to go through the best troll comments for you as well for next time I come on.
100%. We're gonna do that. We should have a Twitch live stream with your YouTube channel as well, and just go through all the comments. It'll be heaps of fun.
That sounds awesome.
But all right. Until then, though, take care, Chris. Take care, Ahmed. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And yeah, until next time. Bye.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Awesome.